if you were to replace this person that ended up making the end mistake with any other person, how likely do you think that that person would also make the same mistake? And often it's very likely.
Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we're the award-winning tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier
and help make our organisations more prepared to face ever-changing human-centric cyber threats.
In this episode, Embracing Failure in Cybersecurity by Learning Through Trial and Error, we're joined by Stefan Gaillard, the founder and current chair of the Journal of Trial and Error, a journal dedicated to highlighting the importance of trial and error in scientific practice and scholarship.
Trial and error is part of the scientific method, but many of us are very risk-averse because we're so afraid of failure, or we take great lengths to cover up anyone finding out that we failed. There's so much shame around admitting to failure, especially in cybersecurity when, let's face it, most of us will eventually experience failure due to our security controls. But hiding from failure, not only from ourselves, but also our peers, means we're missing out on really important learning opportunities. We need to change this. If we don't think about failure more, we're doomed to keep failing. And this is what we discuss in this very episode.
We'll explore the importance of removing the stigma from failure, the benefits and the dangers of tech's fail-fast mentality, what it's like to live in the information overload age, and finally the importance of trial and error. We love this chat and we think you will do too. So sit back and enjoy our interview with Stefan Gaillard. Welcome to another episode of Compromising Positions. Today we're joined by Stefan Gaillard, who is the co-founder and current chair of the Journal of Trial and Error, which is a journal dedicated to highlighting the importance of trial and error in scientific practice and scholarship. Stefan, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so thanks so much for having me. I'm Stefan Gaillard. As you already said, I'm the co-founder and current chair of the Journal of Trial and Error. Besides that, I'm also doing a PhD at the Radboud University, where I look into overhype and overpromising in science. Yeah, I think those are the two main things that I'm currently working on.
Now, Stefan, you're being very modest. Mr. Forbes 30 under 30. Congratulations, 2024. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah. So indeed, I think it was April, we got the news that one of my co-founders and I got selected for the Forbes 30 under 30 list in the category Science and Healthcare. So that was really cool. Unfortunately, our third co-founder was 31 at the time. But also much credit to him.
Much credit to the oldie.
That must be so galling to miss out just on a technicality.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited about this conversation because I heard you on another podcast, friend of the show, Christian Hunt, who has also appeared on this podcast in our very first season. And I remember hearing about your journal, the Journal of Trial and Error, and I was just like, wow, this guy gets it. Like this guy's approach is the way to go. And quite a lot of our talk today on the show is going to be about that. But can you give us a sort of brief overview? What is the Journal of Trial and Error?
Yeah, so we're a scientific journal. We're diamond open access, which means that we're free to read, but it's also free to publish. And the whole purpose of the journal is to what we call close the gap between what is researched and what is published. So in science, a lot of experiments are done, obviously, a lot of research. And yet what we publish is just a part of that. So usually a lot of positive and exciting novel results end up being published. But what we call unexpected results or failed research often ends up in the file drawer. And so there are different things that you can categorize as failed science in a sense. So what I'm talking about when I talk about failed science is on the one hand, negative and null results. So to give an example, let's say you have the hypothesis that putting googly eyes on a bin would lead to more people throwing away their trash. Well, if that's indeed the case, then you get to have positive results. But it could also be the case that people throw the same amount of trash into the bin when it has googly eyes or when it doesn't have googly eyes.
Right.
Null results. Or even worse, people might be less inclined to throw away their trash when you put on the googly eyes. Negative results. So these types of results are often less likely to be published. And you could argue that this isn't failed research, right? The research could be done perfectly, but you just had the wrong hypothesis at the beginning. And yet in science and in academia, it is often treated as a sort of failure. People don't like it when you get these types of results, and they are less likely to publish them, and journals are less likely to accept them. So that's why we call them failed research anyway, even though you could argue that the research is done perfectly. And on the other hand, we also publish research where something indeed did go wrong during the actual research. So a methodological mistake was made, for example, but it might still be interesting for the scientific community because they can learn from these mistakes. So if you're trying out something new, it's very likely that something will go wrong. If it's very new, you have no idea what you're doing in a sense. Of
Just
course,
like in
you're
life.
guided by yeah. Of course, you're guided by theory, etc. But you're trying something very new, and it's likely to go wrong. And it's also likely that other scientists are similarly looking for how to conduct this new research. And if they knew that this is not the way to go, then they can spend their time, money, effort elsewhere. So it's really productive to be able to learn from each other in that sense.
I think that's what struck me as really important when I heard about your work for the first time was the idea that, and it's not something that had even occurred to me before, because I guess, as you say, we're kind of driven by the good news stories when it comes to scientific research. I'm thinking back to my university days when I was reading research papers. I was always more drawn to the ones that either were, as you said, positive science or results that aligned with what I wanted my results to say as well. But what struck me about when I heard you talk about your work was, oh no, actually, if we keep doing that, then I'm just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again because we're not talking about failure in a positive way. Now, it's called the Journal of Trial and Error, and it's a very common phrase that people talk about in life, like when you're learning a new skill and things like that. But what do you mean by trial and error?
Yeah, so I sort of talk about failure and trial and error a lot, so it's good to differentiate it too. So for me, failure would be setting a specific goal for a specific moment in time and then not reaching that goal. So I might have the goal of running a marathon in 2026 or writing a flawless piece of coding by 2025. As long as I reach that goal at that point in time, I have not failed. And if I don't reach that goal, in a sense, I have failed. But along the way, I can have much trial and error. So during my coding process, there might be a lot of instances where my code is not flawless. But as long as it's flawless by 2025, I have not failed. So the trial and error for me is really the little mistakes that you make along the way that you can still maybe fix, the things that go wrong, that go unexpected, but you still have time to do something about. And the failure, because of the inherent deadline that is associated with setting a goal, is in that sense different from the trial and error process. I hope that makes a bit of sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Especially with the coding example. I think anybody who's ever seen my code knows that 99% of my coding process is trial and error.
Yeah.
Or we used to say in Yorkshire, suck it and see programming. Particularly disciplined. I guess so. Trial and error is interesting and I find the whole topic of failure interesting because especially in cyber, there's kind of different elements to failure and trial and error. I think because a failure to protect something in the industry could be quite, rather than being an experiment, would be quite catastrophic. I guess. How do you think maybe could frame things like trial and error and experimentation in cybersecurity? Failure will happen. Failure will come invisibly. As we've seen with then hacks and exploits and 0 days and things like that. Failure just naturally happens to us, unfortunately. But almost intentional experimentation and failure. I guess how could cybersecurity teams maybe embrace the idea of trial and error better in a safe way so they can learn?
Yeah. So for me, one big part is sort of getting rid of the stigma or the sort of moral judgment that many people associate with failure and trial and error. So for example, when I talk to scientists, but also people from other fields, they're very hesitant to label something as a failure. Or they tell me, Stefan, if you call something a failure, you're sort of perpetuating this culture that we're trying to fight against. And I very much disagree with that, especially if you have this definition that I just talked about. If failure is just having set a goal and not reaching a goal, then it's not a moral failure on your part in most cases if you don't reach that goal. There can be many outside influences that contributed to you not reaching that goal. You might have made maybe a too optimistic mistake in trying to calculate how long something would take, but that doesn't reflect that badly on you as a person. So I think really having this different view of failure and of trial and error as a necessary part of life, of any new endeavor, is a big part of it. And a second part of it, I think, is really looking at things like due diligence. So embracing failure, embracing trial and error shouldn't be an excuse to not do your due diligence on the one hand. But on the other hand, a lot of things go wrong working in a complex system. So, for example, aviation industry has long known this. If a plane crashes, we don't immediately blame the pilot. We
No.
look at why did the plane crash? What were all the systemic factors at play that allowed the plane to crash in the end? And that's a lot of things. Like, so for example, something engineering wise might have gone wrong, but then that's the first part. But then it also has passed all the checks. So other things went wrong. So there are multiple points in time where someone could have intervened and this didn't happen. And that's not the fault of a single individual. That's something that you need to change in the makeup of your company, of your checking process, etc.
No, I very much resonate with that. I think people are very quick to, first of all, I think we've got a culture where there's a lot of shame wrapped around failure. And secondly, the finger is pointed. I hear this about stories. I think somebody else, we were discussing this the other week. Somebody deleted something in production and the finger, they were blamed. Like, well, hang on a second. There's a whole system of event, there's a whole setup around how did they get access? How could they make those changes?
Yeah.
How did nobody else spot this? How did their software not,
Exactly.
any intrusion software not catch this? There's a systemic issue that sometimes we just go, no, that person, Jeff in the programming team gets shot because he dropped the transactions table in live.
Yeah.
And really, in reality, it does force us to look inwards a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I did a human factors psychology degree, and one thing that really stuck with me was if you were to replace this person that ended up making the end mistake with any other person, how likely do you think that person would also make the same mistake? And often it's very likely. Also, if the first person in question was, for example, maybe tired, there's a reason that they're so tired at work. The company might be asking too much of them, demanding too much of them, asking them to come in 7 days a week, for example. So that being tired part isn't on that person, it's on the demands being asked of them, the demands being demanded of them. And so there are, of course, some instances where if you do this thought experiment, you might think, oh yeah, that really was that person's fault. So there are, of course, instances where someone is just slacking off on the job, and that might lead to a mistake, and then we can hold them accountable. But in many instances, indeed, just what we talked about, there's something wrong in the whole procedural chain, and the end mistake just happens to be made by a human being.
I guess in that case, would you ever, in your experience, and obviously being the editor of that journal, you get to read a lot about failure, is failure ever down to one single point, or is it usually multiple factors leading to failure? What do you see it more as being? Do you see it more as being there's usually like one big catalyst element, or is it usually there's lots of other things that all just combines to make this big shit show, to be honest?
Yeah, it's almost always a combination of factors because there are these checks and balances. So again, with the aviation example, or with a nuclear plant, or with research conducted in a lab, if a person is tired and they're more likely to make a mistake, a colleague might notice that. The fact that the colleague doesn't notice that also already tells you something about the culture on the work floor, for example. And then the fact that making a small mistake has such big consequences also might indicate, for example, indeed, that the person has too much access or has too much power in a sense. If one pilot making a mistake can lead to a plane crashing, then maybe we should have a system where the co-pilot also needs to agree with certain decisions before they are enacted. So it's always multifactorial, but in the same way that we can look at the systemic problems and trying to address them, there are some cases where the human is part of the problem. So it's still multifactorial, but we can still say, okay, but you really didn't do your due diligence, or you were really slacking off without good reason, without any excuse, and then still hold them accountable, even though they're just one factor among many. But I think in many cases, it's often not down to someone not doing their best or not doing their due diligence, but just...
But why do humans like to blame it on just one factor? Because you hear news stories and they was like, well, they did it. So I'm thinking in cybersecurity, there was a big news story. A company was brought down and they blamed the intern. They said the intern used a rubbish password and they got hacked. And the finger was directly pointed at the intern. Why do we seek out, I guess, the nice, easy, boxed answer of it was that person, or it was that event, it was that system that failed?
Yeah, I think a multitude of factors. So in your example, probably the company doesn't want to own up to their mistakes. So I mean, they've probably made a lot of mistakes in the whole procedural chain, but that doesn't look very good. Well, if you're thinking short term, I think that's a big problem. One of the big problems. If you're thinking short term, then you might think, oh, just blame the intern, keep a lid on it. and people will hopefully think it's just the intern's fault and there's nothing wrong in our procedural chain. But that's, as I said, short-term thinking, because I think in the long term, if you don't change your procedural chain, the same thing is going to happen again. And hopefully people are not stupid enough to keep believing your excuse that the intern did it. So short-term thinking, I think, is one. And I also think that having difficulty dealing with complexity and uncertainty is another big one. People like to have certainty. I see this with science also a lot. For example, funders, journalists, but also taxpayers, they want this easy to understand picture of science without too much uncertainty. You want money going in, scientists doing science, and coming back in a few years with certain answers
Yeah.
that you can use in policy, that you can use in your daily life without having to
Looks good for
contemplate it
tenure.
too much. Yeah, without having to contemplate it too much yourself, without having to take into account the uncertainty. People just want certain, easy solutions too much of the time, I think.
I'd like to describe how I see the cybersecurity industry sometimes and how they deal with failure, particularly public failure. So that I gave an example about the intern, but we see this time and time again. And I'd like your opinion on it, how we could probably do this in a different way. Often you see when a organization has a big cybersecurity breach,
Yeah.
the blame usually goes on the organization. Now, in cybersecurity, I would argue, remember that usually the instigating factor is a criminal wants to do harm in some way, either to steal money, steal data, cause havoc. It's a criminal
Yeah.
element quite a lot of the time in cybersecurity. There is human error, and we can maybe go into that, but let's just say in this example, it's malicious activity, purposeful malicious activity. And I find in the narrative in the cybersecurity profession, we point a lot of fingers, we point at the organization, you should have done more, you should have done this. Sometimes even amongst ourselves, pointing at the security team within that organization saying, what were you playing at? Why didn't you do better? Why didn't you do more?
Yeah.
And again, very similar, if we go very granular, if someone clicks on something in an organization, like a phishing email or something, or downloads something, we blame the user and say, hey, you clicked on something, you downloaded something. Without that recognition that, don't forget, there is this malicious element that's pushing you towards clicking, that's pushing you towards downloading. And you're acting, and I assume most people come to it to do a good job, acting in best intentions against a threat landscape that is ever changing and extremely complex.
Yeah.
What can we do in cybersecurity to start challenging that narrative that this type of failure is not something we can learn from? Because I think that's what this victim shaming narrative, I think we stop learning from each other because of it. Because then people don't publish their findings. They don't say, this is how it happened, this is how we got hacked, let's learn from it as a community. And I just wonder if there's some way, with your experience, how we can, as an industry, a cybersecurity industry, start thinking failure is something we can all learn and benefit from.
Yeah, so I think this touches again on some of the things that we just talked about. So I think the moral aspect is very important here. So as you rightfully point out, there is the immoral actor is the one doing the hacking, doing the breaching, and in the vast majority of cases, it's not the person making the mistake. And if you try to put yourself in their shoes, but really put yourself in their shoes, so the intuitive option might be, okay, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't have clicked the link, because we all know how not to click the link, of course. But if you actually try and put yourself in their shoes, what was their state of mind at the time? How many emails do they get in a day that they have to filter through while at the same time working on deadlines? I think if you do a proper failure analysis, so if you look at what are the steps that led up to the point where this person was tired enough, not thinking clearly enough, whatever it was, to click on the link. I think that's really what you need to do in a proper failure analysis. All those steps are way more important and way more informative than this person wasn't thinking straight, or however people want to blame the end person making the final mistake, as I like to say it, because the very fact that one person clicking on a link can have such big consequences is indicative of many more mistakes being made before the link clicking is happening. So I think maybe, hopefully, such a proper failure analysis and trying to put yourself in other people's shoes can help with that changing attitude. But I know from experience it's very hard to change people's attitudes towards failure and blaming and the whole culture surrounding that. So
I think many parts of this industry would be so much enhanced if we were better at accepting it and also sharing things that didn't work, sharing our failings. As you mentioned there, the examples of Leanne about idea of being able to share what happened when hacks take place, rather than just going, "Yep, somebody did it."
The British
It's
Library did
so
a
powerful.
fantastic
Yes.
write-up of.
Mm.
So the British Library in the UK had a huge cyber attack, took down their. I think they're still recovering from it. Took down their systems. We're a year in now, and
Over a month, it was down completely, wasn't it?
yeah, but they're still completely repairing the systems, I believe.
Mm.
I'll put links
Yeah.
in the show notes to the write-up. The write-up was incredible. It was so incredibly detailed. It was so very transparent. They owned up to their own failings. And
Yeah.
as a result, I sent that round to my team and I said, hey, we could probably do a tabletop exercise and rehash this actually and learn from it ourselves. If we had something similar happen to us, how would we deal with this? And it was such an incredible learning activity. And I was like, why not do this more? And I think there is so much stigma around having a cybersecurity incident that it's we have to get over that fear that if we tell people we have because you will have a bit of reputational damage, your share prices might go down, though studies have shown that after a cyber incident your share prices only go down for a little while and they go back up and sometimes exceed, usually on the premise that you've probably invested more money into your security. Because that's another thing, sometimes failure is good, just because if something doesn't work, maybe you can actually start asking for funding again to make sure it does work. So there is sometimes a positive element to failing that way.
No, exactly. I think things like, indeed, for example, doing a pre-mortem. So you have the concept of doing a post-mortem where something goes wrong and you analyze it after the fact. But a pre-mortem, you come up with all these sort of worst-case scenarios. How could they arise? How would you deal with them? And this can be inspired by other people's actual failures, or you can just try and do it from scratch. And of course, indeed, there needs to be a management culture that allows this to happen. So you need to say actively and also show, so not only say but actively show that you're not gonna fire people if they own up to their mistakes.
So important.
And you should do that, especially because, indeed, as you say, in the long run, I think it's very healthy for companies to have that attitude, and also for research groups, any other non-profits, to have that attitude towards failure. Because as I said also earlier, I think it's very short-term thinking if you're just gonna fire people and hopefully try and blame it on them. But if you do that, then the whole system that you have in place that allows for these mistakes to occur isn't going to be changed and isn't going to be improved.
And I imagine you then instill a culture of fear as well. And
well, think about it, Jeff. Like the role of the CISO is people call that role a poison chalice, because if something goes wrong, you're kind of putting your neck on the line. And CISOs in organizations get fired all the time for cybersecurity incidents. And I have to wonder if, unless there is evidence that there was stuff they can do and they didn't prevent it, etc., etc. I have to wonder, when you've just gone through a massive cyber incident, is removing someone who was previously had all the knowledge and in charge of that department, getting rid of them and firing them, is that the best course of action when you're at your most vulnerable? I don't know about that.
I don't know if this is me not being a cybersecurity person or my ivory tower academia thing. What is it? What is a CISO?
So it is the Chief Information Security Officer. So basically, the person who's in charge of cybersecurity. So Jeff is a CTO, so Chief Technology Officer. CISO is a role that basically same level. Some might argue not as pristine as the role Jeff is, but it's getting better. But yeah, the CISO kind of looks after information security.
Yeah,
which then obviously does come with that quite a lot of accountability for making sure the right kind of things are being followed. And we do have a culture. I mean, the culture certainly in the UK, we see it a lot with whenever a company gets into trouble, maybe it's financial trouble, maybe it's some other management trouble, the CEO just goes, "Oh, that's all my fault. I quit or I've been fired," and then they just roll the next one in.
Yeah,
for the same thing to happen. It's just a revolving door. So it's like absorb all the blame, move on. Nobody fixes anything, which I think is kind of maybe the crux of some of this sort of systemic issues.
Yeah.
You wrote an article some time ago called "The 10 Simple Rules for Failing." Could you tell us those rules, please?
Yes, to first list them all, or
if you can off the top of your head, yeah.
First rule was define failure. Second rule was dare to fail. Then don't compare yourself to others. But also rule 4, do compare yourself to others. Rule 5, keep track of failures and successes. 6, study the system. Rule 7, make failure part of the process. 8, create a support network. 9, find what works for you. And 10, pay it forward.
Oh, I love that last one. Tell us more about the last one. Actually, that really resonates with me.
Yeah, so I think this is just, at least speaking for myself, but I think this is the whole theme of the podcast. I think everyone has experienced failure in their lives, has had points in time where they didn't know how to deal with that failure, felt very lost, blamed themselves, or were anxious that other people would blame them. And many times we've had someone like a mentor assuring us things is going to be okay, or we have had a teacher or a boss who maybe took some of the blame for us, helped us out in that way. I think we've all had people help us deal with our failures, but that can only be if there are people there that help other people deal with their failures. And so I think just like we were helped at some point in our lives, and hopefully will be helped at some point in our lives in the future, so too can we help others deal with their failures, help them in difficult situations, find solutions for them, or just encourage them, or on a more structural level, make sure that they don't get undeserved blame, things like that. So depending on your role towards your relationship with the person making the mistake and your position at a certain institute, I think there are multiple ways that you can yourself help others to deal with failure. And for example, as you said, Jeff in his position can also make sure that it's known within his company that there's a certain way of dealing with failure, for example. So I think that was the main point of the paying it forward.
I also really liked the dare to fail rule because, say, in an industry, it's maybe a little bit different in some ways to academia and the scientific method. But there's so many instances I've seen where people say, this is too risky.
Mm-hmm.
And then say, but innovation only happens with risk.
Yeah.
Innovation you don't just walk out and like a load of innovation falls on you, like rain or something.
Yeah.
And you look at maybe say Blockbuster Video versus Netflix. Blockbuster didn't dare, didn't change, didn't innovate,
Mm-hmm.
and their inactivity, their inability to dare to fail,
Yeah.
I guess just cost them everything. That in itself became the failure, which I found really super interesting.
Yeah. So there's this quote which is often attributed to Einstein, but when I tried to fact check it, I couldn't actually find if it was said by Einstein or not. But the quote is, "If we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research." And I think,
I love that. That's great.
I think that really captures scientific research, but also, as you say, innovation. I mean, if we knew what would be the next hot innovation, the next product that a lot of people want, then everyone would be making it. But that's not how it works. You really have to try things out under uncertainty. And that means that things are going to fail. But the other option, as you rightfully point out, the other option is stagnation. And stagnation is going to be defeated by innovation in the end. Even if the innovators encounter more failures along the way, in the end, if you don't innovate, you stagnate. You're not going to keep up. And also, I think that's a very utilistic sense of looking at it. But besides that, also, I think, at least for me, I'm very curious about things, right? I just want to know how certain things work, for example, in research, or I just want to know if I can make this cool new product. And to do that, you're gonna have to try it out, and failure might be part of that.
Yeah, because loads of people are making fun of all these AI wearables at the moment. There's so many billions of investment into these AI wearables, and then famous YouTuber, can't remember his name, but famous YouTuber comes along and says this is
Marcus Brownlee.
Marcus Brownlee comes along and says this is the worst piece of tech I've ever had. But without someone taking a chance, putting something out there into the world for people to try, to play around with, and give that feedback, yes, that product might not be successful, but the next one might. And we would never have got to that place without seeing a few products
exactly.
fail.
And I think in a lot of cases we have the sort of benefit, in quotation mark, of hindsight. So of course, it's in hindsight, it's very easy when a product has flopped to say, of course this was not going to work. But that's much easier to do when it has flopped than at the point in time where you're trying to innovate, you're trying to see, is this going to be successful or not. And also, a lot of people use a lot of products where I think, really, that's so silly, or that's such a weird product, or why would you use that? But apparently hundreds of thousands of people use it, enough people that it's a successful product. The fact that I find something silly, I might, with the benefit of hindsight, be able to say that. But there are a lot of silly, quote unquote, silly products that do end up being very successful because apparently there is a market for it. So also the fact that something, it's very easy to say when a product hasn't ended up being successful to say, obviously. But you have the benefit of hindsight, and there are a lot of products that are successful that are very similar to the product that ended up failing.
Apple have a great history that people think they invented the MP3 players. Like, no, Creative were doing that for a few years beforehand.
Yeah.
Although, the other side of that coin is I always remember that image somebody snapped of the time that Microsoft held a fake funeral for the iPhone because their Windows phone was going to completely bury the iPhone. So there's two sides to that. And I guess in tech, one of the things, because we can actually iterate quite quickly and we can build things quite quickly, compared to maybe the physical world, in the tech world, we can move quite quickly. And one of them is the goal is to fail fast. And yes, so what are some of the benefits and dangers of taking a fail fast mentality?
Yeah, so I think the benefits are numerous. You get to experiment more. You get to get feedback more quickly from potential consumers. You get to abandon unproductive research lines more quickly. So I think the benefits really are that there's more room for experimentation. There's less waste going to projects that won't end up really innovating or serving some customer need. And that also immediately makes clear the potential pitfalls, I think. When do you abandon a research line, or when do you abandon a product development? If you're too fast and you're failing fast, you might abandon an idea, a theory, a product that you're developing or researching just because of some initial indication that things are not going the way you expect them to, or things are going wrong. Whereas if you just persevered a little longer, then this would have really led to a major discovery or led to a major innovation. So I think that's one big
But what are the
pitfall.
the cutoff points there, though? So how do you decide, like, when is it time to cut your losses, and when's it time to just a little bit longer?
Yeah.
There's a Jeff. You have a toaster, and it's got a function on it where you can just press a little bit more when the toast comes out, and they just toast for a little bit more. There's a little button on there. I wish life had a button where you could just press a little bit more,
Yeah.
and just kind of just push those boundaries a bit without going too far. But where
Yeah.
do you stop? Where do you decide cut my losses, or actually there is still potential here?
Yeah, I think that's a almost, or maybe not even almost, impossible question to answer on a individual level. So in the history of science and technology, there are many instances. So for example, I am currently researching overpromising and overhype, and you might start with let's say a team working on medicine A and a team working on medicine B, and they start with the same promises, right? They both say we're gonna cure cancer, for example, and then team A starts researching. They encounter all these problems, but they keep making the same promises, and at some point in time, it turns out, this wasn't really that realistic. They cut their losses and they abandon medicine A. And a lot of overpromising occurred along the way. And for team B, the same unrealistic promises in the beginning might be made, and then due to some serendipitous event, they might actually end up with a cure for some subtype of cancer. And then everyone would forget their overpromising of curing all forms of cancer because of that serendipitous event that led them to discovering this cure for subtype of cancer. So they're both making the same grandiose claims. They're both doing the same type of research with the same uncertainty. And one team has this serendipitous event and the other one doesn't. And I think that it's almost impossible to control for all these factors. So that's why I think I'm a big proponent. People are often surprised because I'm a scientist and academia, but I'm a big proponent of capitalism. And I think that what's one of the functions of capitalism is that individuals and companies can innovate in different ways. And some might be a bit more conservative, a bit more hesitant with taking risks, and others might be less risk averse. And I think in the very long term, this will lead to some sort of, not an equilibrium, because I think things are constantly changing and evolving. So definitely not an equilibrium. I mean, I think there's a role for more conservative, more risk averse people and companies, and there's a role for more risk takers.
I think it also mirrors like how people adopt things. You always see there's the super early adopters. There's the people who are literally pioneers, the explorers and the pioneers who are like willing to throw $300 or $800 down on an AI system that doesn't work. It's barely out of Then you kind of got the settlers and the people who come in next, and then you got the people who are like good old faithful. I'm okay with Windows. I'm okay with. I still wear wired headphones because I'm not a fan of Bluetooth headphones. But there was definitely some.
Why is
There
what
are
is.
some, yeah, there's some people who are definitely in that. And you actually wrote an article on overpromising in science and technology, and I think certainly experienced it in technology. Are there any other dangers to overpromising?
Yeah, so I think the biggest danger is of overpromising. Again, I think this is the long term perspective. So if you look at the history of artificial intelligence, for example,
Oh, yes.
we've had what we call AI summers and AI winters. So during AI summers, there's a lot of hype, overhype, and overpromising going on. A lot of grandiose claims, a lot of enthusiasm. Enthusiasm itself is great, of course, but if it's enthusiasm that's not grounded in reality, then that will bite you in the ass. I hope I can say that. So you have these AI summers where everyone is overly enthusiastic. There are grandiose claims being made that the field cannot keep, and a
Cybersecurity is
lot of
really bad for that, you know. Cybersecurity vendors are terrible. They're always saying, buy my tool because it completely protects you. Absolutely.
yeah.
You don't need to buy anything else. You don't need to do anything else. Just install this tool. You'll be safe from any threats, current or future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this period, but then, so this what happened in the 60s and 70s, for example. But then journalists and funders started to catch on. Like, okay, but you keep making the same promises the past 10 years. When is AI really gonna lead to world peace, for example? I just recently saw an article. So in the long term, it's really damaging for your field because people start to catch on, like saying, "Oh, okay, you've been making these grandiose claims, but I no longer believe you." And this can taint
Yeah.
also parts of the field which are actually productive, that are actually
Mm,
promising.
yeah.
So, for example, text to speech and speech to text developers had difficulty getting funding because the reputation of artificial intelligence as a field had been damaged so much that funders were hesitant to actually invest in this. Whereas this was actually a quite productive and actually promising field. So I think, yeah, that's one very large detriment of overpromising.
It is the kind of the boy who cried wolf syndrome,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it is very damaging. We're seeing it happening right now, and it's a shame because people are getting tired. Artificial intelligence is a perfect example, over promising and undelivering in some areas because people expect it to be able to design. Go into Chat GPT, design me the perfect house, or play chess. I mean, if you ever challenge Chat GPT to play chess, it makes some very unusual and very illegal moves.
Yeah.
But for its purpose and the other advancements that are being made,
Yeah.
and in things like also image to text as well, are amazing. It's so far
Mm.
away from where it was a few years ago.
Yeah.
And in your article, also, you mentioned you go into some detail around promises and agreements and the differences between them. You just sort of maybe give us a little bit of a potted overview of that, please.
Yeah. So promises can of course exist in many different ways, and it can also exist in sort of one way traffic. So my favorite toy example, a friend of mine says that I always use this example, but I like it. Is I promise to bring you groceries next week Wednesday. This is just me making a promise to you. There is no expected trade there. I don't expect anything back from you in that sense, at least not immediately. I mean, long term friendship, but I don't expect you to give me a bike in return for me bringing you the groceries. So I just promise to do this. But implicitly, there is, of course, an agreement. There's an agreement that I will be there next Wednesday and also that you will be there. So you can be there for me to hand over the groceries. So already there's an implicit agreement, even if the promise is a one way street. But in many cases, we make promises to each other, maybe formally in the form of contracts also, where we come to an explicit agreement and sometimes formal agreement. So I might promise to do certain research to you, and you promise that if I do that research, you will give me the money to actually do that research. And then we make a formal agreement in the form of a signed contract where we note down these promises of actions that we're going to take in the future.
It kind of sounds a bit like, so my background's anthropology, like a bit like reciprocity in
Yeah.
terms of, so the give and take of kind of gifts, and gifts can be not necessarily literal gifts, but tokens of support and things like that. And I can see how
Yeah.
that distinction between a promise and agreement is kind of sticky as well. So this research you're doing, this is your current research that you're looking into. Where do you kind of see that going? What kind of applications do you see that going going in?
Yeah. So my first research article was on what exactly is an overpromise. How can we recognize overpromising? What differentiates an overpromise from a promise? So that the purpose there was really to how can we to have the language in place to be able and the heuristics in place to be able to differentiate between this normal healthy function of promises that's inherent to agreements that we make that are necessary to be able to do any future oriented action together, and this dysfunctional application or use of promises where dishonesty comes into play, deception comes into play, and you make claims about future actions that you cannot keep. And my current research, or I've almost finished this, I developed a search query. So for lay audience, I always compare it to a very fancy Control F, but your audience probably very aware with search queries. But so this allows me to look through large bodies of text for not only words but phrases, etc. And so the search query that I've developed looks for all predictions in a text. So I collect a large body of text. I look for all the predictions made. So let's say you could collect all articles on nanomedicine from the 1980s until now and find all the predictions that scientists have been making concerning nanomedicine from the 80s onward. And I also collect the metadata, so I can see which year it was made, by which person, affiliated with which institution, etc. And my purpose with that is that it allows us to identify continuously broken promises. So a very famous example is Elon Musk. You can find a video clip of him since
He always comes up
2014.
at some point on this show, you know.
Yeah, since 2014, promising wide-scale rollout of self-driving cars the next year, and he makes that promise every year. The continuously broken promise is really indicative of the fact that you probably can't trust his promises at face value, at least. And what this search query that I've developed allows for, I hope, is to be able to find more of these instances, and then maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be from an individual. It can also just be a research field that keeps making the same prediction or same promise that doesn't come true, which would allow us to be a bit more skeptical when this research field makes the same promise in the future. And not only that, but hopefully allows us to identify maybe some research lines. For technology, this could also be innovation lines. I don't know how to say this, but that have been stagnant for the past 10, 20 years. So people keep making the same claim that this specific technology is really coming or is really going to solve X problem. And it doesn't happen. And we can maybe abandon that. Sorry, yeah.
So yeah, I think quantum computing almost falls into that. People keep I think the head of quantum research for IBM claimed that within 5 years they'd have and this was 3 years ago, that they'd have a quantum computer that could solve the discrete logarithm problem immediately, and all of encryption was broken. Like, that sounds like somebody who just wanted more research funding. And I remember there's an interesting quantum supremacy post recently where they said, "Oh, this what we can do now with this quite basic quantum computer would take 1 trillion years on a regular computer." And a bunch of computer scientists said, "Hold my beer," and then created something on a normal CPU, just a desktop CPU, I believe, that solved the problem in 30 seconds. Like, it's kind of it's in that weird miasma of it. People are throwing loads of money at it, but I don't see much like concrete delivery in the quantum supremacy field.
Yeah, so quantum computing and also nuclear fusion are famous examples of this, of fields that have been making promises for the past 30, 40 years that keep not being made. And this again ties to what we talked about earlier, right? So the fact that they've been making these promises for the past 30 years is in itself not an indication that if they make the promise now, that it's unrealistic, right? Because they've been doing the research for 30 years. So they might be at that point in time where they're finally just before the breakthrough. But it does give us good reason to reevaluate the past 30 years if they keep making the same promise without it coming true.
What struck me about your example of Elon Musk is there must be something in line with charisma and ego, because people still keep investing in Elon Musk. His stocks still keep going up. And everyone, it's kind of like an open joke now that, you know, he makes this promise every year.
Yeah.
So once a year when he does these big State of the Union talks for Tesla and things like that, you know, he says, "Oh, it's coming next year," and everyone jokes online on social media. He said it again. But there must be something about, he is so charismatic. He's got such a following that it really doesn't matter if he breaks that promise. I wonder if your research is ever going to kind of account for that kind of character
Yeah.
type, because very rarely people have that much sway that they can keep misleading their audience for so long and misleading shareholders and
Yeah.
the tech community for so long.
Yeah. So the character of the promiser plays a big role in my research, and on the one hand, on the other hand, it doesn't. So in a way, it does, right? So the very fact that we say a person cannot be trusted because they keep breaking their promises, that assumes something about their character or about their judgment. The fact that they keep breaking their promises is indicative of the fact that they're either dishonest or they're very bad at judging whether they are able to keep their promises.
The
They
jury's
might
out
really
on
think.
Elon Musk on that one.
So they might actually think that they're able to keep their promise, but they're just very bad at judging it, or they're actively deceiving people. We can't look into people's minds. So on the one hand, it's very crucial to my research because I do the history of a promiser is very indicative of their character, but it only goes so far because I can't say for certain in many cases whether someone like Elon Musk, for example, is purposely deceiving people or is just a very bad judge of his own character, of his own capabilities. But in a sense, I also think sometimes it doesn't matter. So for me, it doesn't matter whether he is actively deceiving or a bad judge. I know enough to not trust his promises. In other cases, people might be interested whether he's actively deceiving. For example, when it turns into fraud or it comes close to fraud cases. And then there are things in place in the legal system where we try to determine whether the person's intent, which is very difficult. And that's why I try to shy away from it in my research. But intent is a very important characteristic. And also, as you say, a person's charisma and their ability to sway others.
The SEC and the, I think it's the FTC, maybe. I can never remember both of the different bodies in the US are actually coming down hard now on AI washing because that can bump stock. You look at Amazon's just walkout stores. I'm sure that had a bearing on their stock prices because that was the world's first 100% AI-enabled stores. It turns out it's just 1,000 people with CCTV looking at them. These are kind of fraud.
Yeah,
I think one of the interesting things about people like Musk is that their stuff kind of catches on and almost then I'm going to seamlessly segue into almost becomes fake news, and it's not really connected with a cyber because I think it's a part of the sort of the chain of manipulating people and manipulating stock fraudulently or manipulating people. You wrote an article on fake news, and in that you called it information overload instead of the information age. And what do you mean by that? And how might fake news skew our perception of failure?
Yeah. So I come to dislike the term fake news, even though indeed I used it myself.
Sometimes it's just easier, isn't it, just to take the vernacular out because it's a shorthand, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but that's also joining the bandwagon, which I'm against. So I'm correcting myself now and switching to misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is inaccurate information. So if I read a fact on the internet that doesn't turn out to be correct, but I very enthusiastically tell you about it, then I'm already spreading misinformation in a sense. But there's nothing notorious going on. It's just a fact that I misread or read in a wrong source that I tell you about. But disinformation is this targeted spreading of inaccurate information. And then an often used tactic is this information overload. So the more information you receive, the more difficult it is to shift through all that information. And so if you bombard people with information and a lot of that information is inaccurate, or even worse, if a small part of that, but a very crucial part of that information is inaccurate and it's deliberately designed that way, then that's a very problematic use of disinformation for all types of purposes. So propaganda, warfare applications, but also indeed companies that are purposefully spreading disinformation to peddle their wares, for example. And they know that people have limited time to fact check all the information that reaches them. And then especially if you package it in a package where most of the information is accurate, it becomes very difficult to spot the deliberate disinformation. And so the link to failure, I think, there's a tie to trial and error very much as well. So more the misinformation part. So if I'm, for example, in the scientific process, through trial and error, I might come to a correct theory over the course of 5 years, for example. But along the way, I keep updating my information. And at some point in time, that information might be inaccurate. So an example that I often use is from Corona, where we didn't really have much information yet on how effective the mouth masks were.
Yeah.
which is very normal for science, right? We need a long period of time, we need cohort studies, we need large samples to find out whether this is accurate or not. But people, governments, companies, individuals, citizens wanted to have certainty. They wanted to know whether to wear mouth masks or not. So information came out based on the information available at the time, which might turn out to be inaccurate. And people were very surprised, like, 2 months ago they said the mouth masks were helpful, and now they're saying it might not be helpful. How can this be? And there were all these conspiracy theories, but that's a normal part of the trial and error process of science. So I think this wrong view of how science works also leads into this wrong view of the nature of misinformation and disinformation in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And information overload is like one of the key tactics cyber criminals use as well to kind of get people to do what they want. So there's very much connected to that like psychology piece as well. It's like, I'm going to almost physically change how you think and believe and interact with the world around you for my own gains. And it's, it's the same with the misinformation, disinformation. It's the same with getting someone to act in a way they wouldn't, like click on something they wouldn't, or give information out to someone calling saying, I'm your bank, give me your sort code. And something bad is really happening. You need to give me your information so I can stop something bad happening. And actually, it's the criminals themselves.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, actually, that you say that, because, again, coming to the aviation example, so somewhere in the 20th century, cockpits were being redesigned because there were so many alarms in the cockpit that pilots received an information overload when multiple alarms were going off at the same time. They didn't know which alarm was the most pressing. So there might be an alarm going off for something as small as that the seating, there was something wrong with the seat or something. The alarm was the same volume, the same
weight of importance as the rest.
Same weight of importance as the fuel being low. Whereas I would rather have the pilot attend to the fuel being low than to their seating.
Yeah, your heated seats aren't working at the moment. Oh no.
Yeah.
Also, don't look over here. Your fuel's completely gone. Your engines are gone.
Yeah, and they realized, they trained their pilots, but there's only so much you can train, right? So a pilot can be trained to be better at dealing with alarms and differentiating between alarms, but there's only so much that you can train. At some point, you have to redesign the cockpit. You have to have the important alarms be more salient than the less important alarms. And they realized that there, but for example, as you say, in other fields where criminals, for example, are taking advantage of the same knowledge, we still expect that with training, we can just have a person clicking the links, they just need more training. No, maybe they need less cognitive overload.
There is a lot to be said about how we design the world of work with cyber in mind. Sure. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to go into it right now, but I think you are right. I think it's time, to use your metaphor, to redesign the cockpit when it comes to cybersecurity. Stefan, thank you so much for your time today. I have 101 other questions for you. Maybe I'll get you another time as well, especially as your research progresses. But if people want to find you, ask you more questions, which I'm sure they will do, if they want to find the Journal of Trial and Error, where can they do all that?
Yeah, so I'm on, it's called X nowadays, and I'm on LinkedIn, and the Journal of Trial and Error can be found at journal.trialanderror.org.
Wonderful. I will put the links to the show notes for that one.
And I'm sure that your favorite search engine of choice will also pop up if you put in either the journal or my name.
Wonderful. Well, best of luck for the rest of your research. I will be watching and reading what you publish out. I've always found your work really fascinating, and I really do recommend listeners do check out that journal, because there might not be things that are directly related to cybersecurity on there, but we can learn so much from even the failures of others in different fields as well, and how they've approached things. And when I've got a spare few minutes, this is a saved bookmark on my computer, and I will go in when I've got a spare few minutes and take a look at some articles there. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'll be very happy to come back in the future.
Wonderful. Great to hear. Thank you. When failure is inevitable, getting comfortable with it should be a priority now. I think we do some things well in cybersecurity when it comes to failure. We do play with failure with things like tabletop exercises. In a way, kind of doing phishing simulations is kind of like a safe to play failure. I mean, someone always clicks when you do a phishing exercise, don't they? So it must mean that we're kind of expecting failure.
Right, but that's failure in controlled environments where it doesn't sting quite so much. But what we don't do well in cyber is an unexpected failure, which is odd, because the day job is about preventing and preparing preparing for failure, probably more so than in any other area of tech.
That's why a positive thing for teams to do would be to have an agreement about failure and start having honest conversations about failure, about how you deal with failure when it happens, and the reassurance that unless you've gone out your way to do something harmful, that you won't be punished.
A good way to start, I think, would be to read through Stefan's paper about 10 simple rules for failing and start going through it together as a team.
Aye, that's a cracking idea, and if you follow us on LinkedIn, I will create a poster so you can have it up on your team board with the 10 simple rules for failing.
Very nice. Links to everything Stefan discussed in this episode can be found in the show notes. And if you like the show, please do leave us a review and a share on LinkedIn or in your teams. It really helps us spread the word and get high quality guests like Stefan on in future episodes.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time. Keep secure and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?